Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Joe, for that introduction. I will try to live up to the hype. So, as you can see here, this evening I'll speak about weather and climate, both nationally and around the world, as it pertains to environmental security and political instability. And I'm going to draw on two reports from the National Academy of Sciences that I've been involved in, and then kind of go from there. But on the right is probably one of the most gratifying Academy studies I've been involved in. I co-chaired this study with a retired four-star Admiral Skip Bobin, a retired submariner. This study was commissioned by the Chief of Naval Operations to look at the national security implications of climate change for U.S. naval forces in a broad sense. U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, etc. And one of the takeaways from this study was that climate change effects are already being felt across the world's oceans and beyond. Some effects directly impacting national security and U.S. naval forces. And on the left, a study that was commissioned by the CIA, unclassified study by the intelligence community, to look at the impact of climate change on social and political stresses overseas. And the quote there is that the recommendation from this study that the U.S. government should begin immediately to develop a systematic and enduring whole-of-government strategy for monitoring threats connected to climate change. And so these two Academy reports discuss and show how climate change creates sort of impacts and cascading series of impacts across global systems, communities, our military installations. And the reports provide recommendations on how to adapt and reduce vulnerability to weather and climate-related events. And that's what I'll be discussing this evening. So as sort of an outline for the talk, I'll speak about the impact to U.S. military facilities, domestic infrastructure, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and international instability. And some of the common threads through the talk this evening is that climate change is a multi-pronged threat, both within our borders and overseas. Domestically, it affects our military facilities, energy use, transportation, and infrastructure. And overseas, it disrupts food supplies, creates refugees, and can worsen internal and external conflicts. And oftentimes, we hear a lot in the press and in the literature about climate refugees, overseas. But climate refugees are in our country today. I live in New Orleans a good part of the year. And New Orleans is still recovering from the diaspora of New Orleans from post-Katrina. Last year I was in New Orleans just after Hurricane Ida. And for 3 months, people in the river and bayou parishes of Louisiana were without running water and electricity, living literally in tent cities for 3 months. And we just saw it last month with Hurricane Ian down in Fort Myers, Florida. So, with respect to military facilities, here are two pictures from the DoD. On the left is Tyndall Air Force Base in the panhandle of Florida in October of 2018 after Hurricane Michael went ashore in western Florida. Category 5, winds of about 160 miles an hour, $5 billion worth of damages. Every single structure was impacted, destroyed, demolished on that Air Force Base. 17 F-22 Raptor fighter planes were damaged, and that represented about a 10% decrease in that fighter force for the United States. And now the Air Force Base is being rebuilt to withstand 170 mile an hour sustained winds. On the right is Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. This was in April of 2019. where about 1/3 of the Air Force Base was submerged with flooding and raw sewage. Not a great post-dinner time conversation across the entire Air Force Base. Sort of a triple whammy of snowfall, frozen ground, a deep low that dumped about 8 inches of rain on top of frozen ground. So in our Navy study, obviously we spoke about sea level rise because of the Navy being at sea level. A 1 meter rise in sea level is estimated to have an impact of about $1 billion worth of damage on Navy facilities around the world. And as shown here, there's about 128 coastal DoD facilities around the world already today. High tide flooding, king tide, sunny day flooding is contributing to problems with respect to ship repairs in dry docks. In low-lying Paris Island, South Carolina, already they're having sunny day flooding of 10 times a year. Just again, independent of severe storms. So the military is concerned about reliable access to their bases throughout the year, as well as protecting the bases themselves. Now let's speak a little bit about domestic infrastructure. And so infrastructure disruption and failure can cascade across a whole series of economic sectors. Here's a quote from the 4th National Climate Assessment: climate change and extreme weather events are expected to increasingly disrupt our nation's energy and transportation systems, threatening more frequent and longer lasting power outages, fuel shortages, service disruptions with, again, this cascading impacts. So, for example, when Hurricane Harvey hit the Houston area several years ago, led to power outages, cascading effects on critical infrastructure, such as hospitals, water, wastewater treatments. Again, living in the Gulf area part of the year, every time a hurricane enters into the Gulf of Mexico, it shut down oil platforms, often shut down refineries and refining capacity, and then we see a resultant spike in oil prices at the pump after hurricanes pass through the Gulf. And then again, what we just saw with Hurricane Ian last month. Now, the science is divided with respect to climate change and extreme cold events. We kind of think about climate change in the warm season. At least that's what comes to mind: wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, typhoons. And so extreme cold events, the jury, in all honesty, is out. But either way, the U.S. needs to reinforce its aging and vulnerable infrastructure. Major infrastructure failures increase military costs and can affect our readiness. And so what we're looking at here in these two slides are the night lights in Houston. And this was during that severe cold outbreak in the winter of 2021. I actually was traveling by car from New Orleans, spent the night in Amarillo, and woke up to 8 inches of snow that morning. And so on the left, you see the night lights of Houston before the storm, and on the right, you can see the decrease as a result of the impact on power supplies in Houston as a result of the loss of electricity. So along the way, I'm going to intersperse some little sort of science anecdotes. And so, our understanding of impacts and causal factors to drought in the United States has increased dramatically over years. You may be familiar with this plot now. You can oftentimes see on the nightly weather the drought monitor on TV. And so this is example of the drought monitor in 2012. And what we're coming to realize is quite oftentimes it's the sea surface temperature distributions in the Pacific Ocean, sort of upstream, is what sort of initializes or triggers significant drought. And then the severity and the duration of droughts over the continental United States are a factor of soil moisture and snowpack depth. And so this was a drought in August of about 2012, relatively short drought in duration, but still nonetheless caused about $30 billion of agriculture damage in the heartland of the United States. Now let's speak about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And so disaster relief is provided by the military both in the United States and overseas. The military, primarily the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Seabees, provide support for evacuations, search and rescue, medical assistance, emergency supplies. More often than not, it's the Navy that does this because of their forward presence around the globe. That is who we turn to in times of emergencies, and countries around the world turn to when there are national disasters that overwhelm the local capacity to respond. Internationally, benefits include slowing refugee movements, be it a climate event or an earthquake such as in Haiti, and promoting goodwill. This is a significant portion of our soft power presence around the world. And so this image here is from Katrina. I have a number of friends and neighbors that lived through Katrina, and to this day, whenever a helicopter flies over, as the one pictured here, it brings back not so nice memories of that time about 17 years ago. So the Coast Guard rescued about 30,000 people during Katrina. Unfortunately, 1,700 people lost their lives during Katrina. About 1,000 Marines were on site providing additional support to the residents there. About 24 Navy ships were on station offshore of New Orleans, including the U.S. Navy hospital ship, the U.S. Navy Comfort ship, providing hospital beds, about 250 hospital beds, and operation rooms, etc. 5,000 National Guardsmen were in Fort Myers, Florida, and the west coast of Florida last month, providing support to Ian. And again, last month, the U.S. Navy provided airlifts of food and shelter materials into Pakistan following the extensive flooding there. We're going to be talking much more about Pakistan in the slides to come. So with respect to inland flooding, this is a little eye candy. What you're looking at here is basically the heartbeat of the nation's river and stream flow across the United States as weather systems pass over the continental United States from west to east. And this is the output of a model that we developed at NCAR, the Weather Research Forecast Hydrology Model. And this is now the basis for an operational national water model that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration now runs operationally out of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. This is a new capability that's only been in operations for about 3 years now, but was invented by our staff up on the mesa in Boulder. Now let's speak about international instability. Some of you may have heard the phrase that climate change is a threat multiplier. That term was coined by Sherry Goodman. She is one of our trustees on the UCAR Board of Trustees. She was the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. She had a portfolio of about $5 billion from 1991 to 2001. She was one of the co-authors that I was with on the intelligence community study. And so, as discussed here, predicting resource shortages and environmental hazards is fundamental for preparing for and managing cultural and political instability. And so climate change threatens to challenge states and regions that are already fragile and conflict prone. And an example of which is illustrated on the left is severe drought. Played an important role that set the stage for the civil war in Syria not too long ago. This is a graphic from one of the studies I showed at the beginning. And sort of the basis is that people and societies for their lives and well-being depend on, are basically wrapped up in a number of complex and interrelated systems that can be affected by climate change and variability. We're talking about, the basic human needs of access to food, water, energy, shelter, transportation, commercial products. And the sort of schematic on the left kind of describes the situation of this concept of a threat multiplier, in that you can have existing climate conditions. You have other environmental conditions that we'll discuss. And then you have social and political conditions. And so one of the issues for the intelligence community are, where are those regions around the globe where the social fabric of a region or a country is already torn, or a region or a country where the political structures are not very robust or unstable. And it's those areas where climate change might push that society or that region over the edge. So it's not climate change unto itself, but it's these other pre-existing conditions where, this not so subtle nudge can push a region into instability. And what's illustrated here are the various combatant commands for the U.S. military, the Department of Defense. So NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, AFRICOM, CENTRALCOM, and the little circles are just illustrative of potential climate threats in these areas. So the opening of the Arctic to navigation, thawing of the permafrost, wildfires, severe storms, disease vectors, drought stress, access to potable water, etc. So that's what's on the minds of the military and the intelligence community. Now, extreme weather and climate change threaten to challenge states and regions that are already fragile and conflict prone, as I mentioned. And so, over about the past 50 years, on average, every day, a disaster related to weather, climate, or water hazard occurs every day that kills about 115 people on average across the globe, causing about $202 million worth of losses every day across the globe. Over the past 50 years, these numbers of weather, water, climate disasters have increased fivefold over the past 50 years. Now, quote, the good news is, as a result of improved early warnings and better disaster management, the deaths have decreased by a factor of 3 over the past 50 years. Yet, across that time, 91% of this loss of life from weather, water, climate hazards occurs in the least developed countries. And so in those regions, potential conflicts can occur over competition for water, food, energy, resources. You have issues with respect to both melting ice and sea level rise, and then population migration. Again, this concept of climate refugees due to desertification, flooding, and sea level rise. And no better, unfortunately, illustration of that is this past summer. And so here's sort of a slide depicting the heat waves and fires over 2022. Over the summer of 22, the United Kingdom had its first ever extreme heat wave warnings in its history. Japan had its highest temperatures recorded in 140 years. China had factories closed, rivers that were no longer navigable, ordered 250 weather stations across China had their highest recorded temperatures. In the European Union, in the month of July, there were 53,000 deaths above normal due to heat stress. That was only surpassed by the heat wave of 2003 when 70,000 citizens in Europe lost their lives. That's more than all our servicemen that were killed in the Vietnam conflict just within one summer. In India, there were 203 heat wave days defined as a day in which temperature was so extreme that would be fatal to those that were exposed too long. And in Iran, temperature reached an all-time record of 126 degrees. And so these changes in the severity of heat waves, drought, floods, hurricanes are expected to increase in the future with respect to climate change. And our climate change models are, pretty good at the global scale, but they need to get better at the regional scale. Food production, there are going to be winners and losers, as illustrated here, with strong regional effects. So the high latitudes, the boreal forest regions, such as Russia, are anticipated, and high latitude Canada are actually projected to benefit from a warming climate. And yet you could see large swaths of the world closer to the equator, where we're going to see drastic decreases in agriculture, and quite often those project onto the least developed countries. Different version of the previous plot with respect to water stress over the next 15 years, where demand for water is going to rise for support for food, energy, and the use and consumption in cities. Over 600 million people across the planet lack access to clean water, and the World Bank estimates about 80 to 100 million people are going to be exposed to water stress over just the next few years. And again, what you see a lot of relation between this plot and the previous plot, where the water stress is going to occur oftentimes in the least developed countries. 14 of the 33 most vulnerable countries across the planet are in the Middle East, and 9 considered in really extremely vulnerable areas. This is a plot from our Navy study, shown here the top 15 countries by population exposed to coastal flooding today, the pale blue on the bottom, and then the projections to exposure to coastal flooding by 2070 as a result of changes to social and economic conditions, and then climate change. And then, so if we tunnel down a little bit more and focus on the top 20 cities in terms of population, Miami ranks 6th on the list, New York City ranks 17th, and the other 18 cities are all in Southeast Asia. And so if we just now look at the top 10 cities vulnerable to sea level rise, approximately about 80 million people that are going to be vulnerable to sea level rise by 2070. So again, areas around the world that are likely going to be in need of humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and additional demands on the U.S. Navy. Couple of then highlighting some of the findings and recommendations of the 2 studies I started with at the outset. So the one funded by the intelligence community, this study focused on, as I said, social and political stresses outside the United States. And we looked at events that would exceed the capacity of affected countries or populations to cope or respond to disruptive events. And so the key findings in this study were that climate surprises may affect particular regions or global systems, such as grain markets across the globe. Some climate events are going to exceed the capacity of the affected societies to manage. And a sort of a novel concept that we promoted in this study is that, we tend to focus on these singular events, like a hurricane or a flooding event, but we need to be cognizant of the possibility of, a clustering of events across the world, such as we may have like a super El Nino event across the planet, where several regions around the world at the same time would be impacted. That could disrupt vital supply chains across the planet. And a recommendation, the need to have more research on the need to improve weather and climate predictions as it pertains to disruptions, and then those links to political instability, violent conflict, humanitarian disasters, and disruptive migration. And another one of the recommendations we made, it was to borrow from the economic world, where you may be familiar with the stress tests of banks to see, how functional and vulnerable or resilient a particular banking system is. What we propose is that the intelligence community do stress tests on potentially vulnerable regions around the world, and almost do a war gaming or tabletop exercises to pick your favorite part of the world to kind of probe how resilient this particular country or region would be to a climate event. And so now let me give you a case study we highlighted in the report, and it was Pakistan. So shown here is a view of the great Indus River, and many Pakistanis are dependent on the Indus watershed. This is a semi-arid part of the world. 30 to 40% of the water flow here derives from snowmelt. And this is a part of the world where there are, kind of goes both ways. There's a reduction in river flows, then there are increased precipitation and severe floods. We'll talk about that. Extreme heat. And what happens in Pakistan is decisions have to be made during a time of drought of where to divert the water. Is the water diverted to the rural areas for agricultural production, or is the water diverted to the major metropolitan areas, such as Karachi, for the generation of power? And when a decision is made to divert the water to the rural areas, there are rolling brownouts in the major metropolitan cities, causing considerable social unrest and riots. We don't hear about it in the West. And nonetheless, this is a country that has the bomb. So you can understand why this is, even in an unclassified sense, why this is a part of the world that's of extreme interest to the intelligence community. And then just this past summer, tremendous flooding events in Pakistan, where about a third of the country was underwater, literally. Latest count was death toll of about 1,700. Again, it's very eerily similar to the death toll in Katrina. And so we're already hearing comments and communications arising from countries asking for climate reparations from the developed world, given the impacts to the developing nations. And just about 10 days ago, Secretary General commented that climate change is knocking on everyone's door right now. You kind of think about climate change as off in the future, this sort of slow, secular impact to weather events, but it is here and now. Then with respect to the study we did with the Navy, here are the key findings from this study. One of the areas we highlighted was the Arctic, a remote part of the world, expecting increased maritime traffic into the future. It is an area of limited infrastructure, limited ports, air-based facilities, forward staging. At the time of this report, we only had 2 operational icebreakers. One was laid up. We still only have 3 icebreakers for the entire United States. Insufficient charting, melting, thawing of the thermofrost, and since the end of the Cold War, as a nation, the U.S. Navy has lost its sort of experiential edge of operating in this extreme environment. This is going to, even with climate change, going to continue to be a harsh environment. We're not going to see palm trees in the Arctic Circle anytime soon. The sun still sets and never rises in the wintertime. And so we need to gain that experience in war fighting back in this part of the world. Other parts we discussed in this study was the up-tempo, as was kind of foreshadowed, for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief around the world. And you know, this is an impact on our force readiness, because if the U.S. Navy is in this part of the world providing humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, this detracts from our readiness to responding to something else in another theater in a different part of the world. Highlighted the need for increasing need for global maritime partnerships and multinational alliances. Again, the Arctic is a good illustration of that need. We have, thankfully, increased our training with Canada and a series of collaborations and training exercises with Canada. And yet, to this day, the United States is still not a signatory to the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea. That would benefit. I mean, every single Chief of Naval Operations Secretary of the Navy has called for the U.S. to ratify that convention. And lastly, adaptation to climate change, related sea level rise, permafrost melt, and the need for increased vulnerability assessment, very consistent to what was called for in the study with the intelligence community. Here's a picture of the Arctic. This is a Los Angeles class submarine. This photo was taken in 2009. This was my co-chair's last command. This is Admiral Bowman's last command. And so understanding how changes are occurring for sea ice in the Arctic is going to impact our readiness in this region. And so having better predictions of the Earth system is of strategic importance to our military. It is an edge to our military. When, you know, going back to the invasion of D-Day, weather prediction was in its infancy. But our knowledge of sort of a 24-hour weather forecast gave us the edge to have a successful landing under the cover of weather conditions in Normandy. But we need to have a better understanding to predict when the Arctic is going to be ice-free so that we can have better prediction capability. You may recall in 2007, Russia planted a titanium flag at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, staking out their purported claim. So going forward, the Arctic Ocean is going to be a theater of operations for cooperation amongst nations, like I said, like with Canada, competition for resources, oil, gas, mineral, fishing, and albeit low, but conflict is clearly something to be considered in the Arctic. So I talked about sea ice prediction. This is visualization from NCAR projecting sea ice concentration extent in the Arctic towards the end of the century. And what some of our scientists have realized is this whole aspect of looking at the Earth as a coupled system, one of the aspects of which is that the overturning circulation in the Atlantic Ocean plays a critical factor in determining the decadal scale variability of sea ice in the Arctic. And yet, we're still dealing with a non-linear chaotic system. And right now, we may not know with clarity to plus or minus a decade when the Arctic Ocean is to be open with respect to navigation in the summertime. So to push further with respect to this prediction area, which my background is, we need more and better observations. We need cutting edge, high resolution Earth system models, especially at the regional scale. And when I talk about Earth system, my community remains siloed. I'm an oceanographer by training, leading an atmospheric science organization. But we have the meteorologists over here, we have the oceanographers over here, we have the hydrologists over here. And yet the questions that society is asking us today can only be answered if we look at the Earth as a coupled system. In my section of the National Academy of Engineering, Admiral Mike Mullen is a member, former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he spoke to us once. And he spoke about not the silos we're in, but cylinders of excellence. And I like that sort of visual sort of example. Yeah, we need to be breaking down these cylinders if we're going to make progress in these areas and the need for higher performance computing. So to conclude, some closing thoughts. There's something on the order of 3,500 military installations across the globe, and the DoD has reported that the biggest impacts to date on our DoD facilities are drought, wind, and non-storm surge related flooding, and I gave you some illustrations of that. Climate change is intensifying these disasters around the world, increasing the risk of food and water shortages, potentially destabilizing potentially vulnerable regions. And what my community needs to do is improve the science-based guidance for providing this environmental intelligence to better inform where these security risks are. And to do that, our national security organizations require a comprehensive government-wide strategy that relies on the best available science to build resilience to extreme weather and climate events both here and abroad. And so with that, I thank you for your attention. Be more than willing to entertain your questions.
Just a quick one. You highlighted a number of issues with the change in climate that are out there. I think I saw today a report that there's a potential impact on future pandemics as well. Any thoughts on that?
So one of those little circles was on disease vectors. And so the waterborne diseases or precipitation-caused diseases, so malaria, dengue, clearly we expect to see an increase with those as a result of increased precipitation flooding. Cholera is another one with inland flooding. Colleague of mine, we've written several papers on cholera incidents. With sea level rise in Bangladesh, serious issues with cholera. So the answer is yes. And those primarily related to water in one way or another.
In regard to Puerto Rico and the devastation there, they've lost 90% of their crops, and we're worried about what will happen with them and the support we can give them, and the fact that many may leave and come to the United States.
So I don't have all the facts in front of me, but Hurricane Maria, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, that was a disaster that didn't have to happen. That occurred not too long after our Navy study, and we foreshadowed that sort of what a lack of inaction in Puerto Rico happened. I would have to say, even though 1,700 people died in New Orleans from Katrina, as I showed, the U.S. Navy was there. The U.S. Navy was not there in Hurricane Maria. It was something, if I get my numbers right, it was something like 7-10 days or so before, I think it was the Mercy was on scene in Maria. Did not have to happen. I mean, clearly we're going to have lost of life, but there was a lack of inaction there.
Another question here.
You had the chart of 2070 that showed sea level rise. How much was that sea level rise? Was it 6 inches, a foot?
It depends. It depends where you are around the globe. So it varies. So sea level rise, we think about it as, we'll toss around 1 meter, but there's actually it can fluctuate anywhere by up to an order of magnitude over the global average. And so I don't have those numbers, but it fluctuates from one region to another. And it has to do with the bottom topography, what the tides are, and things like that. So it's not just one, too often we focus on global mean temperature or global mean sea level rise, when in fact the regional impacts, as I said, could be an order of magnitude more than the global average.
Another question back here.
You mentioned a treaty that has not yet been signed. What are the obstacles to the signing of that treaty? And can you reiterate the treaty, what the treaty is about, please?
So it's politics, all right? I don't want to be, there are some in Congress that think we're giving away something, that we'd be giving away our rights to offshore minerals, etc. Whereas if you try to look at it objectively, we stand to gain so much from collaboration and providing certainty to our industries, so even to our extractive industries, to what they can and can't do. And so, one of the biggest things for the private sector is uncertainty. They can't deal with that, and so it's politics.
Yeah, I'm curious what your opinion would be in terms of the solutions to climate change, specifically within the United States. Where do you think we are in terms of the solutions for climate change? Let's just say on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being we're doing nothing, 10 we're doing everything in your opinion we could possibly be doing. And then the same question for the rest of the world.
How much time do you have? So there is no silver bullet to answer that question, even in the United States. We need to take a portfolio approach. So it is renewables, it's carbon sequestration, it's modular nuclear, it's conservation. The biggest thing we can do is conservation. I would say we're 3.5 on that 10-point scale. I am optimistic with respect to technology, that ultimately, when the private sector knows they can make a buck and succeed, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, there'll be a game changer. We're not there yet. About a month ago, we hosted Speaker Nancy Pelosi at NCAR, and it was just after the Infrastructure Reduction Act was signed. I mean, that is a game changer right now for our response to climate change in the country. So very positive in that regard. With respect to the world, I'd say the Europeans are probably at a 6. I'd say they're 2 times, 100% ahead of us. And then yet you've got the developing nations, I've said throughout my talk, where you just don't have the capacity to respond. Quite frankly, we can adapt. We can go higher. We can add more air conditioners, etc. We can build new structures. We can afford it as a leading nation to adapt. Yeah, we're going to have some changes to our lifestyle, but we can adapt. But there are wide swaths of the world that can't adapt, and you've heard it before. We've benefited by polluting, the atmosphere, the industrialized world. Yet it's those least developed nations that are suffering as a result of our pollution. And so, I'm not all that, encouraged by what the prospects are for, a global solution. Montreal Protocol is always held up as a shining example. So yes, collectively, the world can pat itself on the back with respect to chlorofluorocarbons and refrigerants. That's a big difference from going to changing and weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels. But again, in the United States, it is a mixed approach. There is no one, and then of course, the other one, You know, we don't like to talk about it. There's the whole topic of geoengineering and climate intervention. And you know, for the last 150 years, we've been doing geoengineering, not by design, but by pumping fossil fuels into the atmosphere. But if we think that 1.5 degrees Celsius is a point of no return, we need to have, as you know, distasteful as it is, all arrows in our quiver with respect to pumping sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere or building huge mirrors, etc. So again, I'm optimistic, but I'm trying to shoot straight with you.
Another question over here.
There's a lot of discussion about, excuse me, the cost, like the recent hurricane. But I mean, isn't a lot of this, I mean, I look around this room and I think, there's a lot of my peers around here. We've all lived through, and where we lived on the East Coast or wherever, whether they were hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever, fires in Colorado or whatever. Isn't part of this issue really around the world, the massive population gain and the massive, in the United States particularly, you don't have 2 and 3 real bedroom, 1,200 square foot homes. And so when you have damage done, it's in the billions, it's not millions.
So in that chart I showed with coastal flooding, the social economic growth, that has to do with population growth. At the table I was at, we were discussing it at dinner time. You know, if you look at the so-called hockey stick chart, if you look at over the past 10,000 years of increases in CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, it's flat and then basically jumps up. If you look at population growth, it's exactly the same sort of curve. You know, people don't like to talk about population growth, but they all are intertwined. But there's no denying that as a result of population growth and our addiction to fossil fuels, that is what has caused global warming. And to reverse it, we need to have, you know, deal with it in these other ways. And then the other aspect is, you know, yes, we've adapted. Yes, over our lifetimes we've been exposed to it. But collectively, over our lifetimes, we've been able to get flood insurance. People in Florida, I lost my hurricane insurance in Florida and in Louisiana because all the insurers pulled out of the state of Louisiana, just like Florida. And so Louisiana's going to self-insuring, Florida's going to self-insuring. So right now, we're going to see a massive change in those that can afford to live in coastal regions.
Another one here.
And same probably with wildfires.
Yeah.
So would carbon tax provide more motivation for research and solutions?
I mean, I would not say as much research, but solution. I mean, it is a self-regulator on the process. But you know, there's been talk about that. But again, it's wrapped up in politics. But you know, a carbon tax, from my understanding, reading literature, a carbon tax can be imposed that does not have a deleterious impact on our economy, and would have that built in incentive. Yes.
Any other questions over here? Oh, Richard.
U.S.-China relations, something I'm very interested in, are heading straight downhill, unfortunately. But if anything were available to try to build some bridges across the Pacific for world health, etc., it would seem to me climate change research, action, and so forth. Do you have a sense of what sort of exchanges are going on right now, private, government,
Sure.
with China?
Yeah, I mean, I'm living it right now. Some of our ocean models, we had a collaboration between Texas A&M and Qingdao Ocean University. So those of you who chinned out beer, and it was a great partnership in that one of our challenges, I put in one of my penultimate slide was high performance computing. We were getting access to high performance computing, but more importantly, access to software engineers for our codes, all unclassified. However, there's a potential dual use here. We were, all open source model codes, high resolution ocean models, but concerned in some parts of Congress where we had to answer letters that these ocean models could be used by Chinese military in the South China Sea. So we're seeing more and more of the leading climate research being done out of China, citation indices going up from our colleagues in China. So there's a lot of potential, but there's a big but there as well. So sort of trust but verify sort of situation right now. It's not an easy time right now to be collaborating.
Well, let me ask a question on China. I would like to follow up a little bit on it. In March, before this group, Bruce Jones from Brookings, one of their China specialists, was talking about trade and how China is becoming the dominant shipping trade.
Yep.
And he was saying they are really poised to exploit the Northwest Passage.
Absolutely.
Would you comment on that?
Sure. So we know Costco, but one of the major shipping lines is the Chinese Costco shipping lines, without the T, I think it is. And so in our Navy study, that was one of the maritime nations. We focused a lot on Russia, but China as well, where they are preparing with a series of icebreakers to support maritime commerce across the Northwest Passage and the open Arctic. Whereas we are still, I will have to say it, twiddling our thumbs as a nation in that regard.
Yes.
Is cloud seeding okay?
Oh boy. It remains a very debatable topic in the field. So we've done work. We have a number of cloud seeding activities. It can produce positive results. Right? Having said that, it's really caveat emptor out there. I mean, so you got, I don't know how many of the ski resorts pay for cloud seeding for snow. Well, if you're, let's say, so I ski at Vail. Well, let's say if you cloud seed at Vail, what does that mean for snow at Copper Mountain, further to the east? Because if there's no moisture there, you can put all the silver iodine you want up into the atmosphere, but there's no moisture there for it to precipitate because it's been taken out upstream. And so, yes, it works, but its viability, is it really cost effective? The jury's still out on that. And then that's the segue to geo and climate engineering. That's sort of cloud seeding on steroids. And so, one of the topics there is, what happens if a rogue nation, such as some of the nations we've talked about here this evening, unilaterally decides to put sulfate aerosols up into the atmosphere to cool its part of the world? What are the downstream influences? So that's why there's a lot of research needs to be done. Not saying to do it, but to do the research so that we have a better understanding of unintended consequences. So thanks for that question.
We got time for another question?
Can I
Here we
ask
go.
one more?
Yeah.
Here's mine here.
Joe, this person.
You're next.
Hi, you briefly mentioned methane, and I was wondering, everybody talks about carbon dioxide, or anyway, where's methane as far as what you think its importance and also legislation about it?
It's methane, mixed metaphors, is really low-hanging fruit. We can kind of deal with it, be it for agriculture, with respect to methane escaping from petroleum lines, etc. And why, it's order 10, 20 times much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So that is one of the things that we can and should and are dealing with. So it is, it's first in the queue really to be dealing with, because it also drops out of the atmosphere much faster than carbon dioxide, which can last in the atmosphere for 100 years or so. So yeah.
One last question.
I'm looking for something hopeful. Whenever you face some issues, what opportunities might be there? Hopeful, positive opportunities for the U.S. and the world as we go forward.
As I said before, one conservation. That's the easiest, cheapest thing. They have the biggest impact. And so, how we support ourselves, we need to walk the talk as citizens. And then, as I said, I'm cautiously optimistic with respect to technology. Problem with technology is the scaling issue. To be able to scale up globally to have an impact. But just look at the revolution in communications over a relatively short period of time. But number one, conservation. Yep, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much.